Countries along NATO's eastern border are weighing wetlands as a frontline defence, as fears of a potential Russian invasion are lingering. In Latvia, the army aims to rewater drained peatlands that could serve as natural barriers along the Baltic Defense Line. DW's Grzegorz Szymanowski reports from near the Latvian border with Russia.
This is what Latvia's border with Russia looks like these days. Roadblocks, cameras, and high fences topped with barbed wire. Colonel Andris Rieksts has been overseeing the border's modernization. He shows us how Latvia is also turning the landscape into part of its defense strategy, beginning with this river on the border.
By diverting the flow of the water, we can artificially flood these territories if needed, so we can create an additional barrier in a crisis.
And the Latvian army is also looking at the peatlands scattered along the border.
Along the Baltic Defense Line, we have many peat bogs. We strongly support the idea that every natural barrier that can be restored and created will only help in building this defense line.
Peatlands cover around 10% of Latvia's territory, but over half of that area has been drained to harvest peat for fuel and agriculture, as well as to clear land for farming. Scientists like Mara Pakalne are working to reverse that. She's been studying how to restore bogs like this one, just 2 kilometers from the Russian border.
You can close the drainage ditches and the water will not be flowing out of the bog anymore, so it's even better for the defense.
And she adds, bogs like these not only help slow Russian tanks, they also fight planet-warming pollution at the same time.
When you drain peatlands, they are starting to emit all the greenhouse gases. So if you restore a peatland, you keep all the carbon in it.
It looks like solid land from a distance. But underfoot, the peatland is soaked through with water. Every step sinks, every move drags. It's hard to keep balance here. And this is exactly why countries like Latvia want more of this kind of terrain on their border with Russia. Its lethalness became evident in this peat bog in Lithuania, where a US Army armored vehicle sank during NATO exercises in March, killing 4 soldiers. It took nearly a week to recover the vehicle. But what was a tragic accident for NATO troops is now being turned into a defense strategy. And by shaping the landscape, Latvia can focus its resources on blocking other routes from Russia.
We see Russia's actions, what they say and do to their other neighbor, that is Ukraine. So we can't say we are building our defense line only temporarily.
Here in the Latvian borderlands, the political divide between the West and Russia is increasingly visible on the ground. These man-made barriers are now being augmented by less visible, natural ones.
Now, for more on this, let's bring in Marina Miron, defence analyst at King's College London. Marina, these peatlands in Latvia, how do they fit into NATO's defence strategy on the whole eastern flank?
Good afternoon, Gerhard. Well, this idea of creating peatlands or rewatering the areas is, of course, an interesting idea which should fit into the broader deterrence posture by NATO countries on the eastern flank, because a barrier like that alone is not going to stop advancement of the troops. And there are different factors that should be taken into consideration, not least the fact that the Russians also know about wetlands, and the Soviets have used wetlands in the Second World War, actually on Ukrainian territory at that time. So it is nothing new, and it's not something that cannot be overcome. Mm-hmm. And of course, if NATO is talking about creating those defensive lines, rest assured, if Russians ever decide to attack, they will be looking for ways to avoid those routes. or choosing specific weather, such as, for instance, in winter when everything is frozen, then you shouldn't have any issues. And the assumption is that the Russian incursion will take place in a particular way, using tanks, using infantry, but it could be different. So what I'm trying to say here is that it shouldn't be the only single component, which requires time, which requires investment, which requires also calibration of regulations amongst, say, Poland, Latvia, the countries that perceive themselves to be at the highest risk on the eastern flank, as well as their citizens, those who own those lands, for instance, in Poland, and the agricultural sector. So there are a lot of matters that need to be taken into account when taking this decision and allocating funds.
So not a perfect defense, but certainly helpful. How would you sum up NATO's current posture overall along its eastern borders after the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, NATO has been trying to reinforce its deterrence posture on the eastern flank with deployment of more troops to the Baltic states, because there are quite a few vulnerabilities when it comes to the Baltic states and maybe to a lesser extent Poland. When it comes, for instance, to air power, when it comes to artillery, when it comes to air defenses, and generally speaking, troop numbers. But those are just a few issues that NATO is trying to work on. Let's put it this way, NATO is recognizing the shortcomings that it's facing on the eastern flank. And the defense spending has been increased amongst NATO members. The problem is turning that money into capabilities, and the progress is very, very slow. So there are a lot of good plans and initiatives, but it takes time to actually integrate them. And because of bureaucratic processes and regulations in every member state, it's very difficult for NATO to act swiftly in this regard.
Now, NATO is shifting towards a broader defense ecosystem, including infrastructure and cyber. That's what we keep hearing. Are they not putting enough attention and money onto classic defenses?
Well, the problem is trying to balance everything. On the one hand, NATO needs to be prepared for quote-unquote hybrid threats, where you have maybe cyber attacks or sabotage or incursions. And that doesn't necessarily always involve the military or is in the military domain. In other words, law enforcement agencies have to work closely with militaries if it comes to using armed forces as a potential deterrent or a response to a specific incident. But this is a domain of law enforcement, generally speaking, also when it comes to the likes of drones or especially cyber attacks, because it also depends on what target these cyber attacks are pursuing, what is a designated target and what effect they seek to generate. So generally speaking, there are many threats. Some of them are non-military threats, some of them are military threats. And so it is very difficult to work out a way of plugging all the gaps in defenses, both conventional and otherwise. And certainly you're correct to point out that conventional defenses have been somewhat sidelined because there is a shift of focus to cybersecurity, to digitalization, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult to put priorities and to allocate funding. And as I said before, to get all the member states of NATO to recognize whatever threat it is. For instance, southern European countries don't see the threat the same way the Baltics are seeing, and they don't experience it the same way. Therefore, there needs to be a harmonization.
Thank you very much, Marina Miron there.
Thank you for having me.